The distress call reached the Coral Season at 0340 ship time, and Ensign Priya Okafor almost deleted it as junk. That was the trouble with the deep lanes. Every few days some automated buoy screamed about pirates or reactor failures or ancient shipwrecks, and every few days it turned out to be a malfunctioning transponder talking to itself in the dark. Priya's thumb hovered over the archive key. Then she read the header twice. The signal wasn't garbled. It wasn't automated. It was a voice, layered under 3 translation protocols, and underneath all of them was a sound the Coral Season systems had never been asked to classify before. Someone screaming for help who did not know how to ask for it properly. She woke the captain. Captain Desmond Vance arrived on the bridge in an undershirt with his boots half-laced, which told the rest of the skeleton crew everything they needed to know about how seriously to take the next 10 minutes. He listened to the recording twice, arms folded, jaw tight. "That's a Ansara vessel," said the systems officer, an older man named Reyes who had spent 11 years cataloging alien radio chatter before the Coral Season ever left dock. "Civilian make. Diplomatic class, maybe a cultural transport. Under attack by what? Unclear. Their sensor logs are garbage. Either their equipment's failing or they don't know what they're looking at." Vance rubbed his eyes. "The Ansaru haven't reported a hostile contact in what? Recorded history?" "Not once," Reyes said. "Not since first contact with anyone as far as the archives go. There's no combat doctrine on file for them. No defense protocols. Nothing." "Then what are they screaming about?" Nobody answered, because nobody knew, and the not knowing was worse than anything Priya could have named. She looked at the plot. The Ansaru ship was 4 hours out at flank speed. Whatever was happening to it would be finished, one way or another, long before the Coral Season arrived. Vance made the call in under a minute, the kind of decision humans still made in the kind of situations most of the galaxy had stopped believing were possible. "Set an intercept," he said. "Charge whatever weapons we've got. And somebody find me every scrap of Ansaru language data we're carrying, because I have a feeling we're about to need it." The Coral Season was not a warship. It carried no weapons designation, no gunnery crew, no combat AI worth the name, because for 80 years, since humanity had joined the wider galactic community, nobody had needed one. The Sethi Accord, brokered generations ago by a precursor species so old and so revered that most cultures simply called them the Keepers, had ended organized violence between spacefaring peoples. Not through treaty, through something closer to surgery. Nobody fully understood how it worked. The Keepers had gone silent centuries before humanity ever left its own solar system, but their gift remained. An inherited generational conditioning, passed down through every species that had signed the Accord, that made large-scale coordinated violence feel, to them, almost physically impossible. Not forbidden. Unthinkable. The Ansaru did not have laws against war. They didn't need any more than a human needed a law against flying by flapping their arms. Humanity had entered the Accord too recently to receive the conditioning. Some species found that unsettling. Most found it merely quaint, the way an old country cousin might find a family heirloom quaint. A strange thing to still be carrying around, interesting at parties of no real use. Nobody on the Coral Season was thinking about parties now. Priya spent the 4-hour burn doing the only useful thing she could think of, reading. Not tactical manuals, the Coral Season didn't have any, but her grandfather's books, digitized and half-forgotten in a personal archive she'd never expected to open outside a history seminar. Accounts of Midway, Stalingrad, the evacuation of a beach called Dunkirk by 10,000 small boats that had no business being there. She read them not because she thought they'd help directly, but because they were the only maps she had of a kind of terrain nobody else in the galaxy remembered existed. By the time the Ansaru ship came into visual range, she understood 2 things that would matter more than any of them yet knew. That panic looked the same in every language, and that humanity was the only species heading toward that panic instead of away from it. The Ansaru ship was called the Verse of Still Water, and it was dying by inches. Its hull was scored along one flank where something had raked it. Not a clean weapons burn, Reyes reported, but something closer to a boarding action, crude and physical. Its running lights strobed erratically. Half its crew, when Vance finally got a channel open, were audible in the background, not fighting but keening. A high mournful sound that translated, roughly, as grief for something that had not yet finished happening. The Ansaru who answered called himself Telashirin. He was some kind of cultural attaché, Rhea's guest from the honorifics, not a captain in any military sense because the verse of still water had no military sense to draw on. His voice, once the translation settled, was almost unbearably calm. The calm of someone reciting facts about their own drowning. "We do not know what has boarded us," he said. "They came from a ship with no registry markers. They took 11 of my crew into the lower decks and we do not know why. We attempted to reason with them through every channel we possess. They do not respond to reason." "Do you have weapons on board?" Vance asked. A long pause. "We have tools. We do not have weapons. We have never needed weapons." Vance looked at Priya. She was already pulling up deck schematics the Ansaru had transmitted along with their distress call. The first practical thing anyone aboard the Verse of Still Water had thought to send, though clearly not for tactical reasons. It read like a museum floor plan. Wide open galleries. No choke points. No blast doors rated for anything but decompression. A ship built by people who had never once imagined needing to defend a room. "Ran," Vance said. "I need you to listen to me carefully, and I need you to trust that I know something you don't. Can you do that?" "You are human," Ren said, as if that answered the question on its own, and in a way it did. What happened over the next 90 minutes would later be studied, argued over, mythologized and picked apart by scholars on a dozen worlds, most of whom would get the details wrong in the retelling. What actually happened was smaller and stranger than any of the later versions. A handful of frightened, undertrained humans talking a ship full of terrified pacifists through the oldest problem their species had ever solved for itself. Priya didn't lead a boarding party. She wasn't a soldier. Nobody on the Coral season was. What she did was worse in some ways and more effective, she talked. "You have people in your crew who worked in cargo handling," she said to Ran, reading off the manifest data with a steadiness she did not feel. "That means you have people who know your ship's mass distribution. I need them to seal every internal door between the intruders and your bridge. Not to stop them, just to slow them down. Every second you buy is a second we're closing distance. Sealing the doors will trap them with our people below," Rin said. "Sealing the doors will trap your attackers in a smaller space with less to lose by staying calm," Priya said, and heard the shape of the idea land somewhere in the silence on the other end. Not understanding, not yet, but the first crack in the assumption that resistance and cruelty were the same thing. Vance took the next problem, and it was uglier. "Your crew who are cornered. Do any of them have access to the environmental controls in the lower decks?" "Two do. I need them to vent the heat in that section. Not to kill anyone. To make it miserable enough that whoever's down there wants to move somewhere else. Somewhere you choose, not somewhere they choose." There was a long, strangled pause. "You are asking us to hurt them." "I'm asking you to make one room worse than the room next to it," Vance said. "That's not hurting anyone. That's hurting. Shepherds have done it to their own flocks for 10,000 years and called it kindness." Reyes, meanwhile, had found something in the Ansaru sensor logs nobody on the Verse of Still Water had thought to flag, because they had no framework for reading it as significant. A repeating pattern in the intruder's movement between decks, the same route taken every time, never varied. Whoever they were, they moved like people who had rehearsed a plan and had no capacity, or no need or no interest, in changing it once conditions shifted. "They're not improvising," Reyes said. "That's either very disciplined or it's not a crew at all. Might be automated. Might be following someone else's orders to the letter." "Does it matter which?" Vance asked. "It matters a great deal," Reyes said. "Predictable things can be led. If they've got a fixed route, we don't need to fight them through it. We need to make sure the last room on that route isn't the bridge." It did not go smoothly. 12 minutes into the venting sequence, one of the two Ansaru crew members working the environmental controls froze entirely, hands hovering over a panel she would not touch, because the panel had never in her life been used to make anything worse for anyone. Priya talked her through it the way she imagined someone, somewhere, must once have talked a nervous recruit through a task that felt like betrayal of everything they'd been raised to believe about themselves. "You're not hurting them," Priya said again, slower this time. "You're making a choice for them that they didn't give your crew the chance to make for themselves. That's not cruelty. That's the floor. Everyone gets the floor." "I don't understand the floor," the crew member said, voice thin. You don't have to understand it yet. You just have to do it once. Understanding comes after. It was, Priya would think later, the single strangest sentence she had ever heard herself say, and also the truest one. The crew member's hands moved. The temperature in the lower cargo section climbed. Somewhere below, whatever intelligence guided the drones registered the change and did. Finally, the one thing 11 confused Ansaru had spent the last half hour trying to make it do. It moved somewhere else, into the corridor Kalu's cousin and the others had already sealed everything around, into the one room on the ship built, almost by accident, to hold something in rather than let it wander free. It took 40 minutes in total to redirect 11 confused, grieving Ansaru crew members, coached in real time by 3 humans who had never fired a weapon in anger in their lives, into becoming, however briefly, something the galaxy had no polite word for anymore. Not soldiers, not warriors, just people who had decided, under guidance, that survival was worth more than the discomfort of resisting. By the time the Coral season pulled alongside and its own tiny complement of crew, armed with nothing more than emergency tools and a plan crib-bled together from a 200-year-old memory of how humans had once defended themselves, boarded the verse of still water, the intruders had already been funneled, section by section, into a cargo hold with one door and no working environmental controls of their own. They weren't defeated. They were contained. It was, Priya would reflect later, the least violent violence anyone had ever organized, and it had still cost the Ansaru something they hadn't had to pay in living memory. The knowledge that it could be done at all. The intruders turned out to be exactly what Reyes had guessed. Automated drones, unmanned, dispatched by a faction the Ansaru had never heard of and the wider Accord had no record of either. A splinter group operating somewhere past the mapped edge of Sethi space, testing. It would later become clear just how far a civilization could be pushed before something in it remembered how to push back. That was the detail that mattered. Not that the verse of still water had survived. Ships survived accidents all the time. What mattered was that something out past the edge of the map had. Anything that wanted to kill them. I've only read about people who did. Then teach me what they knew. The program ran for 6 months, in a converted amphitheater the Ansaru had once used for poetry recitals, and Priya spent most of it feeling like a fraud. She taught what she'd read as a teenager and reread on Tgon, looking for a species that had forgotten how to defend itself, and had very nearly found one, and the only reason it hadn't succeeded was that a human transport happened to be 4 hours away with a crew willing to remember on someone else's behalf. Word of what had happened aboard the verse of still water moved through diplomatic channels the way all uncomfortable truths move through bureaucracies. Slowly, then all at once. Within a month, the Sethi Accord's Oversight Council, a body of representatives from 41 species, none of whom had needed to think about defense in longer than most of their civilizations had existed, convened an emergency session that Vance and Priya were both awkwardly required to attend. The chamber was circular, built for consensus rather than confrontation, and Priya understood within 30 seconds of walking in that the room itself had never been designed to hold the conversation it was about to have. The debate split, more or less, into 2 camps, and Priya spent the session watching them talk past each other with the particular frustration of someone who already knew where the argument would end and had to sit through it anyway. One faction, led by an Ansaru elder whose title translated loosely to Keeper of Records, no relation to the actual keepers, argued that humanity represented a live cultural contagion. They carry knowledge our ancestors were spared for good reason, the elder said, through translation that made the words sound more clinical than Priya suspected they'd been intended. The Accord did not simply forbid war. It removed the idea of war as a tool anyone would reach for. Every hour humanity spends among us is an hour that idea sits in the room, waiting to be picked back up. The other faction, smaller and considerably more anxious, argued the opposite. That the verse of still water had survived only because that idea had been in the room. A delegate from a species Priya didn't recognize. Tall, quiet, folded in on itself like a closed fan. Put it more bluntly than the diplomats around him seemed comfortable with. We assumed the threat that ended war was extinct because the keepers told us so, 3,000 years ago, and we never once checked. Humanity checked. Humanity never stopped checking. That is not contagion. That is the only working alarm system left in this civilization, and we have spent decades treating it like noise. Vance was asked to speak. He hadn't prepared anything, which Priya suspected was exactly the point. Nobody in that chamber wanted a rehearsed answer. They wanted to see, in real time, whether the thing they were afraid of behaved the way they expected. "I'm not going to tell you whether we're dangerous," Vance said. "I don't think that's a question anyone in this room can answer about themselves, honestly, and I don't think it's the question you actually need answered. You need to know whether you can survive without us if something like this happens again. Right now, you can't. That's not an insult. That's just what your history looks like. Because for 3,000 years you didn't need one." A third delegate, representing a species allied closely with the Ansaru for over a century, raised a question nobody else in the chamber seemed willing to voice directly: whether the Accord's conditioning could even be trusted to hold, now that its inheritors knew, definitively, that the danger it had been built against was not extinct after all. "We were told the Keepers removed the possibility of war," the delegate said. "Not the memory of it. The possibility. If that is true, nothing humanity teaches us should matter, because the door was never there to walk through. If it is not true, if what was removed was only the memory, and the possibility remains underneath it, waiting, then every hour we spend telling ourselves we are safe is an hour we spend lying to our own children." Nobody answered that directly, which Priya understood even then was itself a kind of answer. "And if we ask you to teach us," said the Keeper of Records, in a tone that made clear she considered the question a trap regardless of the answer, "what does that cost us?" Vance was quiet for a long moment. Priya watched him choose his next words the way she'd watched him choose which door to seal first aboard the verse of still water. Not quickly, but without flinching once he'd decided. "It costs you the thing you've had for 3,000 years that we've never gotten to have," he said. "It costs you not knowing what this feels like. I can't give that back to you once it's gone. Nobody can. That's the actual price, and I'd be lying if I told you it wasn't steep." The council did not reach a decision that day or that month. What it did instead, in the way of every bureaucracy Priya had ever encountered, human or otherwise, was authorize a study, a narrow, closely supervised pilot program. A small number of human instructors embedded temporarily with a small number of Ansaru volunteers to determine whether defensive knowledge could be transmitted without transmitting whatever else came bundled with it. Priya volunteered before Vance had finished reading the assignment aloud. She hadn't expected to be picked. She was an ensign, not a strategist, and the 2 weeks she spent preparing lesson plans felt at times like an elaborate joke at her own expense. A 26-year-old sensor technician about to lecture an ancient civilization on the subject of self-preservation. But when she stepped off the shuttle onto Ansaru soil for the first time, the joke stopped feeling funny almost immediately, because the first person to greet her was a young Ansaru named Kaluvash Dorath, no older than she was in relative terms, who had lost a cousin in the crew taken below decks on the verse of still water, and who looked at her not with suspicion but with something closer to desperate hope, the look of someone who has just been told, for the first time, that the unbearable thing that happened to them might never happen to anyone else if only they learned the right words. "You are going to teach me how to protect people," Kalu said. It wasn't a question. "I'm going to teach you what I know," Priya said, because she'd promised herself on the shuttle that she wouldn't oversell it. "That's not the same thing. I've never protected anyone from he burn out to the verse of still water. Not tactics exactly, because she didn't have real tactics to give, but the underlying shape of things, why a defended position needed depth, not just a wall, why morale mattered more than equipment, why the worst decision was usually the one made out of panic rather than the one made too slowly. She brought in recordings, translated crudely, of human accounts from wars 2 and 3 centuries gone, and watched a room of Ansaru students listen to them with the stricken, rapt silence of people encountering grief that wasn't theirs but somehow recognized them anyway. Kalu turned out to have a gift for it. Not for violence, which never came naturally to any of them, but for the colder discipline underneath it. Seeing a room and understanding instantly which door mattered and which didn't. 6 weeks in, Kalu redesigned the amphitheater's own emergency egress without being asked, purely because the flaw in it had started to bother them the way an unlocked bridge door had started to bother Priya 4 months earlier, half a system away. Not everything went smoothly. 2 months into the program, a training exercise meant to simulate a corridor breach went wrong in a way nobody had anticipated. One of the younger Ansaru volunteers, a quiet student named Fanorai, collapsed mid-drill, not from exhaustion but from something closer to a panic attack that none of the Ansaru instructors present had a word for, because their language had never needed one. Priya sat with him afterward in a small side room while the exercise continued without them, unsure at first whether anything she said would help or simply make the moment worse by naming it. I kept seeing my own hands doing it, Funurai said eventually. Sealing the door. Venting the room. I understood why. I still felt like I was becoming something wrong. You're not wrong, Priya said. You're just early. Every human who's ever done anything like this felt exactly what you're describing the first time and usually the 10th time too. We just didn't get to stop having wars long enough to forget that feeling was normal. You did. That's not a flaw in you. That's just what 3,000 years of not needing this does to a person. Does it get easier? Priya thought about lying to him and didn't. Some of it gets easier. The part where you can make the decision faster, yes. The part where it still costs you something, I hope that part never gets easier. The ones back home who it stopped costing anything, that's not usually a good sign about them. Funurai didn't return to the program the following week, and Priya never pushed him to. 2 others did leave permanently over the following months, and each time the Ansaru administrators overseeing the pilot asked, quietly, whether the departures should be counted as a failure of the program. Priya always gave the same answer. That a species which could still lose people to the horror of what they were learning was a species that hadn't lost the thing worth protecting in the first place, and that the day nobody left the program shaken was the day she'd start worrying about what they were actually being taught. You're better at this than I am, Priya told Kelu once, meaning it, on an evening when the amphitheater had emptied out and only the 2 of them remained among the old poetry recital benches. I don't think that's true, Kelu said. I think I'm faster at learning the shape of it. You're the one who already knows what it costs. It was the truest thing anyone had said to Priya in 6 months, and she didn't have an answer for it, so she didn't try to give one. The threat that had boarded the verse of still water did not go away simply because the Accord had noticed it. Over the following year, 3 more incursions were reported along the same edge of map space. Probing attacks, never large, never quite enough to justify the kind of galaxy-wide mobilization that might have ended the problem outright, but exactly enough to keep the question the Council had convened to answer from ever fully closing. By the time the second incursion reached a system defended by Ansaru forces trained under the pilot program, Keluvash Dorath was no longer a student. They stood watch on a coordination deck not unlike the one Priya had once talked Ren through, calm in a way that unsettled the older Ansaru around them, issuing the kind of small, unglamorous orders. Seal this door, vent this section by this many minutes, that Priya had once given as an ensign 4 hours from a dying ship and no idea whether any of it would work. It worked. The drones were contained without a single Ansaru life lost, and this time nobody needed a human transport 4 hours out to make it happen. Priya was not present for that one. She heard about it secondhand in a message that reached her months later and half a system away, and she read it twice before she understood why her hands were shaking. Not from fear and not quite from pride, but from something closer to relief so total it felt structurally similar to grief. She had spent a year teaching people a language she'd never wanted her own species to need, hoping the entire time that teaching it would make it, eventually, unnecessary, and here, for the first time, was proof that it could be handed off, that it didn't have to stay hers or humanity's, forever. The Council's final report on the pilot program ran to 900 pages, most of them the kind of dense procedural language that dies quietly in an archive somewhere and is never read again. But its closing paragraph, drafted jointly by the Keeper of Records and the folded, fan-like delegate who had first argued in humanity's favor, was shorter, and Priya kept a copy of it long after the mission that had sent her to Ansaru soil was over. We convened this council believing we were being asked to decide whether one species should teach another how to fight. We were wrong. We were being asked to decide whether a civilization that has forgotten how to grieve for what it lost 3,000 years ago is willing to remember, even partially, even briefly, in order to survive what comes next. The humans did not bring us war. They brought us memory. What we do with it is, at last, no longer theirs to decide. Years later, long after the pilot program had folded into a formal exchange, long after Keluvash Dorath had trained instructors of their own on 3 other Ansaru worlds, Priya found herself back on the Coral Season, older, quieter, no longer an ensign, watching a new distress signal blink across a console that had once seemed impossibly foreign and now felt almost mundane. This one wasn't from the Ansaru. It was from a species she'd never heard of. 3 systems over, using a translation protocol the ship's computer took nearly a full minute to untangle. She read the header. She did not delete it, and she did not hesitate because she had learned, in the years since the verse of still water, that hesitation was the one thing this particular kind of call could never afford. She woke the captain. A different captain now, a man named Osei who had been a lieutenant the last time Priya wore a junior officer's insignia, and watched him read the message with the same flat, focused stillness Vance used to have, the stillness of someone deciding, without needing to be told twice, that the next few hours belonged to whoever was screaming on the other end of the signal, whether or not the rest of the galaxy had remembered yet how to answer. "Set an intercept," Osei said, and Priya was already moving before he finished the sentence, because some things, once learned, never had to be taught twice. Not to her, and increasingly, not to anyone willing to listen. Osei paused at the hatch, half turned back toward her. "Does it ever get easier? Watching one of these come in." Priya thought of Fenori's hands, of the crew member who wouldn't touch the panel, of Kaluvash Dorith standing calm on a coordination deck a year after losing a cousin to a corridor nobody had known how to defend. She thought of the 900 pages of a council report that had ended, in the end, on a single honest paragraph, and of how many other paragraphs like it must be waiting unwritten in whatever came next. "No," she said, "but it gets clearer. That's not the same thing, and I used to think it should be. I don't anymore." She keyed the intercept course and watched the numbers resolve on the plot, for hours to a species she had never spoken to, in a language the ship's computer was still learning to untangle. Somewhere at the far end of that signal, someone was about to discover that memory, however unwanted, was still the fastest thing in the galaxy. Faster than distance, faster than fear, faster even than the 3,000 years it had taken most of a civilization to convince itself it would never need it again. The coral season came about and did not hesitate, and behind it the dark closed up the way it always did, patient, indifferent, keeping its own kind of record of everyone who had ever answered a call like this one, and everyone who hadn't. The END.